Hey folks, it's Swank Ivy here with another Letters to an Asexual. This is number 84, and coming up to Ace Week this year in late October, as I make this video in September, it's come to my attention that for Ace Week we're going to be focusing more on not so much the awareness week kind of thing that we've done in past years, but more about just asexuality in general. Less, hey, we exist, and more, hey, what can we do about the fact that we exist? Can we focus on some of our special issues, some of our interests, some of our goals, some of our political positions, and so forth? And in the spirit of that, I would like to talk about something that, weirdly enough, is very near and dear to my heart, even though it does not personally affect me because I don't pursue romantic relationships. And that is the fact that people tend to assume that romantic relationships will exist in a specific prescribed way, that they can be expected to include certain elements all of the time. And although asexual people are not the only people that this will affect, the expectation that sex is always a part of romantic relationships is a concern to many asexual people and their partners or their potential partners. And even though, of course, I would not want to advocate choosing one person in a relationship over the other to prioritize their needs, what I have noticed is that the more sexual partner in a two-person relationship tends to get prioritized by everybody who gives advice to the couple, everybody who talks about whether the couple should stay together. The terms that they use to talk about the needs in that relationship are usually focused on the either ace person or somebody who desires less sex or no sex is looked at as the problem. And the person who needs more sex or wants more sex is looked at as a person who's being unfairly deprived. And what I would love to see in relationships like this that could incorporate asexual people and could incorporate lots of other people with different needs is an acknowledgement that everybody in a relationship is equally entitled to happiness and also responsible for communication about what that would look like. So I have seen in at least one, maybe two of my previous Letters to an Asexual videos that I've had to cover the topic of people in relationships who believe that they're simply entitled to a certain amount of sex, or that sex should be considered a guarantee in relationships, and they never even think about what message that sends to not only their partner, who may not feel the same way, but to everybody who has relationships and everybody who might be considering getting into relationships. And one of the problems is that you see a lot of asexual people who simply didn't know that there was any other option because they had been fed by society this idea that sex is part of relationships always. There is no negotiation, and if you don't like it, it's your problem, you should be ashamed of it, and you should do everything you can to try to accommodate the other person because they're the one that has the needs that matter, that deserve to be satisfied, and our suffering is just because we're selfish or because we have a problem or that we need to get our shit figured out, so to speak. And it's not like that. Everybody who is participating in a relationship has, like I said, an equal obligation to communicate about their needs as well as an equal level of entitlement to happiness. So, in that spirit, a while back I shared one of my essays on this topic on Twitter, and I got some pushback from a man because, of course, it was a man. Interestingly enough, it was a gay man this time, but I'm going to read my conversation with him, and I'm sorry in advance about how repetitive it gets because he just kept making the same points, but I think some of y'all will recognize that feeling of going in circles and beating your head against the wall, and you might be interested to know how I exited the conversation, where my line was for where I don't want to talk to a person anymore because they've crossed a certain boundary, or they've talked to me a certain way that I no longer find acceptable or respectable. So I will begin with reading you the tweet that I first started the journey with. Let me see. I think this is going to be... it's not too long for my email. Okay. I emailed it to myself. So the tweet that I began my Twitter thread with was this. Once had a man claim to be supportive of asexual people, but he believed they must disclose before trapping innocent, regular people like him in sexless relationships, and yet admitted he hadn't discussed sexual expectations in his relationship because he shouldn't have to. A man wandered into my comments to say this. You can support asexual people and not want to be with one. Sex is a big part of a relationship, and is something that in most relationships happens naturally without some prior schedule or agreement. While his delivery was wrong, I don't entirely disagree, and 100 points symbol. My response. And if sex is important to someone in a relationship, he should express that to his partner, regardless of if they're ace, and not just insist that it's an expected part of every relationship on his terms if nobody warned him otherwise. If sex is a deal breaker, yes, break the deal. The man replied, well, the norm for relationships is that sex is something that follows. Regardless, you don't tell your partner you want loyalty, it's just expected. You don't tell them you want to be treated good, it's expected. Along with many other things we don't necessarily discuss in relationships. I replied, forget norms. You do not assume someone is the norm on a vital issue in your relationship. You have the damn conversation. For something deeply important to both of you, you must communicate. Insisting on the right to avoid this makes you an unsafe partner, not just for aces. He comes back with this. You can't be mad he doesn't discuss it because society is ran by norms, so he, along with millions of others, don't think they need to talk about something like this, and while sex is not the only thing, I think if you plan to not have it, you should take the initiative to tell them first. So I get a little serious and I say this. I live in the world. I understand that people do expect sex and take it for granted. It's something I want to change. And yes, I can be mad that people sit around making marriage relationships with people and they don't talk about what their needs are. Talk to each other. If everybody's happy with how the sex is working out, sure. There's nothing to talk about. But this guy married a woman, and they never talked about their sexual expectations, and now he says it is entirely her fault for not disclosing. Why didn't he talk to her instead of expect? It's because of norms that the conversations are left to simply not happen. We need to normalize basic communication, especially if it's about something you're going to feel harassed about or abandoned without. If the ace person knows, yes, they should say, but you also need to realize that people, especially women, in more conservative sexual circles are told to be abstinent until marriage, and are told they'll love it when they finally do it. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Many times the ace person doesn't know. How can they say? So this guy radically misunderstands me and says this. If you are abstinent, that's something you need to tell someone immediately. That's like someone having cancer and not telling you until it's terminal. You tell people things like this up front, especially if you plan on being with that person so they won't get mad at it. I replied with this. You're ignoring the basics of this issue. Aces are constantly shamed into sex they don't want, and may not feel comfortable planning to be abstinent. They think they must have sex to deserve a relationship, and are not empowered to speak about it. That changes with communication. And of course, now he needs to remind me that his needs not being prioritized so unquestioningly is oppressive to him, and he says this. Well, basically what you're saying is that I should suffer because of your uncomfortability and inability to properly communicate your feelings. If it's going to take all this, you need to get yourself together and figure you out before coming in someone else's life. Sigh. So I say this. I imagine if sex is super important to you, you'd make it known, and the other person wouldn't be confused at all about what you want. Great, but this guy didn't do that. As for me personally, I don't date people, so I don't have this issue. But if I did, I'd talk about it. My purpose in discussing this issue is to make people understand there is no guaranteed amount of sex in a relationship. Aces sometimes have relationships with non-aces, too. And they figure out individual compromises. It is not a given. All partners need to take responsibility. But he's not done, and goes on with this. Also, I am not saying that norms are bad or good. I personally don't live by societal norms because I'm gay, and that in itself is not one. However, being aware of the world I live in, I am aware that some things need to be discussed in a relationship, period. You'd think a gay guy would do a better job understanding non-heteronormative standards, but even with all we have in common with gay men, I guess he is still a man who deserves and expects sex. So people like me are obligated to come with a warning label to avoid any inconvenience it might cause him to, have to talk to a person about their expected intimacy. God. I say this. Yes, and ideally if a person is ace and knows it, they should be able to talk about it. Just like a non-ace person might want to talk about what sex is acceptable and negotiate. The point is everyone, not just the ace person, needs to discuss their needs, not assume it's a given. He replies, "You may not know what you like, but you know that you are unsure of what you like, which is why you should either let the person know that you're unsure from the beginning, or refrain from relationships to save yourself and others the emotional roller coaster ride." Oh yeah. Now that's reasonable. Let's just avoid relationships entirely because we're afraid of hurting someone and deal with all the sneering from people who say we can't really know we're ace because we never tried relationships before. Yeah, definitely demonstrating a good understanding of what instructions we need from someone like him to function in the world. Ass. I said this in response. That is a very weird way of reinterpreting my very basic expectation that people in relationships should communicate about their desires, and if they're not compatible, they shouldn't be in a relationship. Each person in a couple is half the relationship. Both must communicate. And he continues to miss the point and starts yammering in a circle. Your idea of communication is great. However, it is the very lack of it from people who decide to change the norms of relationships that cause issues. For example, asexual people, or people who want polygamy, these are not norms, which is why you should take it upon yourself to express it. So I waste my keystrokes and reply with this. And like I said, norms and over-reliance on them is the problem here. You are an unsafe person to be with and to support ace people if you insist that there's a default for sex within relationships and that it's automatically in effect unless someone objects. When two people have a relationship, each is equally responsible for cultivating happiness. I'm not saying the ace person shouldn't or can't. Ideally, they can too. But it sure makes it hard if responses sound like, "But I had a right to expect we'd have X amount of sex." And this guy, determined to remind aces that they're the broken ones, so nobody should ever have to have this conversation, continues with this. What I'm saying is that if you have something abnormal about your sexual preference, race, or religion, it is up to you to disclose those things. If you live in the society we live in, to avoid miscommunications, you say things like this from the beginning. And I repeat, yes, I know that's what you're saying. That's the problem. You're saying the ace is the weirdo and therefore bears all responsibility for putting on a warning label, even if, as I pointed out, they lack the tools in this society to feel this is even negotiable. But if we foster a world where everyone discusses their desires and no one simply expects, we will have healthier relationships in general. And like I keep saying, the dynamics of desire and consent are not just black and white, not just ace/non-ace, not just all or nothing. And we get another heaping help of, "But your goals are for a better world, are fantasy, and I actually like reality the way it is because it serves me. So I'll keep blathering about how it's not realistic to expect a man to have a conversation." Watch the little chap go. Yes, this would be great, but unfortunately that is not the world we live in. And some things are so deeply rooted in society, we are still a long, long way from changing. For example, racism is still alive because the norms of it are too deeply embedded in society. Wait, did he just say it's not worth having any conversations about racism because we're all just too racist and there's nothing we can do about it? Yikes. Well, here's what I said to that. That's not the world we live in. Well, why do you think I'm trying to change it? Why are we even talking about this if you agree my perspective would be ideal, but you think it's unrealistic, only to reiterate that you do find it reasonable to assume sex is a given? He replies, because I am a realist. And every day there are things I want to change about society that are objective, that aren't necessarily bad, like expecting sex in a relationship. That I agree with. But you have to be realistic on why people follow norms in the society. And I say this, be a realist then. And realistically, you won't likely ever encounter a situation like this in your personal relationships. But every time someone reinforces it's the norm, it's how it is, and actually I like it, they make it harder for people who suffer under that status quo. And he says this, so if you're expecting someone to start a conversation they have never had, and knowing that it's you that's going to deviate them from their norm with a relationship stipulation, I think you should start the convo and not get mad at someone else when they don't, if they never have. I reply, trying not to feel like I'm beating my head against a rock. You're continuing to ignore the fact that aces don't always know their ace, and don't always know they're going to hate sex if they do, and can be shamed by society and their partner to believe they must have sex if they expect love or a relationship. It's not simple. And he goes on to say this, my precise point is that while I may be open-minded, yeah, no, you're not. Most of society is not, which is why you need to take the initiative to start conversations about sexual things and relationship expectations that go against the norm, because other people do not think like that. Also, if I have been in several relationships and never had to do something, you realistically can't expect a person to change their ideals with something like that. Which is why if you have a special stipulation, you should be the first to express it and not blame the other person. My reply, it is exactly because aces are a marginalized minority that they need to be treated with care and understanding. I don't understand what anyone has to lose if they have very strong opinions about what sex they deserve, but don't think they need to tell the person they love. As I said in the thread, if you know your sexual needs are unusual, yes, I advocate having that conversation. My problem comes in when we absolve the normal person of any responsibility and insist they have a right to expect sex will be on their terms. So he continues to miss the point and goes on with this. Discuss this from day one. There will be no confusion, or before it gets too serious. There won't be any entitlement. I think the insisting and entitlement comes after the bond has formed. But if you take the initiative to discuss that beforehand, then it will eliminate lots of stress. I mean, considering that we're having this conversation on Twitter in a hypothetical situation, and he's mad about what sex some random person might be owed in a relationship with me that doesn't exist, I think it's safe to say that people do have this feeling of entitlement to sex, regardless of whether they're invested in a specific relationship. But hey, I guess people who have never had relationships before are always going to know what their needs are going to be in these relationships, and they're going to be able to explain them with full terms and conditions before they break any normal people's hearts. So now I say this. It's not always possible to discuss from day one. People find out by being in relationships what they like in relationships. And that's why you have to talk. You figure it out together. Nobody should be blaming the other. Cultivate your relationship equally. If you've ever read any discussions of asexuality, so many people find out after years of misery and years of accepting sex they really hated that it isn't a given, that they must have sex or must accept something is wrong with them if they don't like it. That is so common. Instead of compassionately working out what will function as a compromise, many default to insisting that the more sexual person deserves satisfaction and the less sexual partner is the one with the problem and bears the responsibility for the issue. That's a real problem. It's not always possible to find out every deal breaker before you get emotionally invested. When someone has more experience realizing their particular issues, they can be more forthcoming about it, but many people navigate these issues without resources or guidance. But, this guy was apparently born knowing exactly what he wanted in a relationship, and, well, more likely, what he wanted in a relationship matched closely enough with what society kept telling him to expect, so he never thought to question it, right? So he said this: yes, there are many emotional deal breakers. However, figuring out your sexuality will benefit you more than anyone else, which is why you should take the time or let someone know from the beginning that that's what you're doing, not expecting them to be okay with something they never dealt with. Me again. And again, if they do know, they should share what they know. That's the point of advocating communication, which is not just the domain of a person with more unusual sexual needs. Just like with pronoun disclosure, it makes it easier for all if we normalize these conversations. He says this: well, if you don't know what you want, how do you expect someone to accept it? I still think you should take time to figure your own sexuality out before dragging someone into it. So I ask the real questions here, folks. And how would you suggest someone figure out their sexuality? Last I checked, people figure out who or how they love by loving. People with more typical desires don't have any guarantee that they've figured it out either. Make space for communication and this becomes easier. But he didn't have any issues, so he thinks it's easy and gives us this advice. There is no formula for it, but I did it, so it's possible to figure out your sexuality. But before driving someone into it, and you're confused and expecting them not to feel angry or sad or any emotion for that matter, take time to figure you out first. He admits to having several relationships. He's clearly been in a bunch of them that didn't work, and I would venture to say he's probably broken some hearts in those relationships. And even if it wasn't about sex, it doesn't make sense to say, well, you have a responsibility to figure out everything that could possibly upset and break the heart of the other person before you ever get into a relationship. You have to have everything figured out and never get in any relationships. That's your responsibility, because you're the weirdo. I reply, you keep saying this, so you clearly won't listen to me when I've said 7 times now that people often do not come into relationships already knowing this about themselves. But just disclose! Doesn't work when they don't know and can't figure it out in isolation. I guess he finally got exasperated because his next response to me was in all caps. And he gave me this lovely little condescending response. Well, sweetie, there it is. That's not how it works. You don't get to blame someone else for you not knowing about your sexuality. So here's how I replied. Yikes, you well-sweetied me. I know people like you believe it's our job to accept blame while you repeat that a harmful status quo is actually good because you don't mind and haven't struggled. Boy, is this entire conversation disgusting, and it really has a fitting end here. So I blocked him. And looking back at how many times I had to say the same thing with him being like, but you have to figure things out and the other person deserves a perfect experience with you to never have to struggle with your crap. Like, I feel like I should have blocked him earlier. But at the same time, I guess I thought I was going to say something that was going to get through to him. But it really disappoints me that I started that Twitter thread to provide a link to a pretty well-structured essay that discussed all the ins and outs of why this kind of belief about what you are owed in a relationship is damaging to not just asexual people, but everybody who needs to learn how to communicate about their desires. And he chose not to learn from it. He just chose to repeat a lot of the same damaging rationales in our conversation. And like I said twice in the conversation, show everyone that he is not a safe person to have relationships with or really to discuss asexuality related issues at all. And it grosses me out that he opened by suggesting that he does support asexual people, because I don't think any of this counts as support. I do understand where people are coming from, where they've just lived in a world for so long where they've never had to examine why what they desire is propped up by the status quo and why the rest of us who don't fall into that are hurt by it. They've never had to ask this question, but compassionate people and people who are progressive and people who want to have some compassion for the rest of the world and push forward with a more inclusive agenda will learn to listen to people saying the kinds of things that I'm saying and question what is inside of themselves, instead of doing what this person did and say, I'm sorry, but the status quo serves me and I don't see anything wrong with that because I'm really happy with it. I would love to keep expecting sex in relationships and never have to have this conversation. And having a conversation with someone is just so much to ask. Why should I have to ever do something I haven't done? You have to do that because you're weird. I mean, statistically speaking, yeah, we're weird. And if you want to be an advocate, if you want to be an ally, if you want to help a group of people who struggle sometimes in a society like ours, then he is a really good example of how exactly not to do it.